Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this ECFR webinar, fresh and early, the morning after the German election. We're going to look at the results and what they mean for Germany's foreign policy. We're asking, will Germany lead or lag in its next foreign policy chapter? But I think first we're going to talk a bit over the election results and then take it from there, I think. So I'm Jeremy Cliffe, I'm Editorial Director and Senior Policy Fellow at ECFR, and I'm delighted to be joined on this dramatic political morning by two experts from ECFR. We will soon be joined by a third, but for now we have Jana Puglierin, head of ECFR Berlin and a senior policy fellow at ECFR, and Janka Oertel, director of our Asia program and senior policy fellow. Thank you both for being here, fresh and early. Well, let's just start with the results. We now have a provisional result from yesterday's German election. I'll rattle through the basics just so we've got that as a foundation for our conversation. CDU-CSU, I think, performed towards the lower end of their expectations on 28.5% of votes. SPD probably towards the higher end. I don't know if you both agree at 16.4. I think they probably were expecting something a bit worse. Greens probably towards their lower end at 11.6. FDP out of the Bundestag on 4.3%, so below the 5% threshold that you need to have representation there. AfD probably around the base case for them at 20.8%. The Left Party, a remarkable victory on 8.8%, a remarkable comeback from a party that until fairly recently looked like it was at death's door. And perhaps most dramatic of all, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance on 4.97%. So that was confirmed in the early hours of this morning that they've just missed the 5% threshold, so won't be in the next Bundestag. And that leaves us with a Bundestag of 5 blocks and a narrow majority for the another grand coalition between the CDU-CSU and SPD, although not enormously grand because this would have a relatively small majority compared to some of the kind of the sprawling numbers that Angela Merkel's GroKos used to command. So that's the basics. Let's just start with your reactions. I'll go to you first, Jana, and then you, Janka. But what strikes you most about this result? What do you take away from it?
So maybe my top three are first, some sort of relief. I am quite happy that it will be enough for the CDU-CSU to work just with one coalition partner. I think that tends to be more stable, although the SPD will have quite a strong hand in the coalition negotiations because, I mean, there is an alternative to working just with them, but still it's pretty hard to find one. So, and they can play this well. And they can always also pressure the CDU-CSU with the claim that they want to go to their bases and ask them and have a vote on the coalition treaty. But this gives me hope that we will form a somewhat stable government that, especially on the foreign policy challenges, will be able to find a joint direction, especially because the new kind of leaders in town in the SPD will be Lars Klingbeil, who I think just worked a miracle because this defeat was not blamed on him, and Boris Pistorius. They are both very pragmatic. So this gives me hope. As well, second point kind of comes from the fact that 80% of Germans did not vote for the AfD. Still, I don't want to sugarcoat anything here. The AfD has doubled its result, and especially the results in the former GDR are really breathtaking. They are everywhere above 30%, oftentimes above 40 or 50 in kind of smaller villages. This is in the East, this is a landslide for them. And they will be a very strong opposition party because I think they will constantly try to weaken Merz and the CDU by just emphasizing again and again that Merz is now working basically with the socialists, and how much more could be achieved with them as a partner, and how basically little this alliance with the SPD makes sense. And then my third big takeaway before we go maybe to foreign policy more specifically is the debt brake question. I think this is painful. I think the government has missed an opportunity to agree on some broad package, especially on defense, before the election. And now we're in a somewhat strange situation because we need the parts of the opposition, I think not a very large part, but parts of the opposition to agree with a possible black-red coalition on the debt brake. And while Die Linke is, I think, generally very open to abandon the debt brake, specifically for defense, they were not going to do this. And so we have this alliance between, basically the AfD and Die Linke on the debt brake. AfD fundamentally opposed, and I think not wanting to help the government. Die Linke fundamentally open, but very much against higher defense spending. So where the money comes from is still an open question. These are my three initial takeaways, I think.
There's a lot there that I want to unpack, and actually some points about the coalition and the domestic political dynamics before we come on to the foreign policy. So let's do that before we pivot to the outside world. A couple of other housekeeping points that I neglected to mention in my enthusiasm to hear Jana and Janka's analysis. The first is that you can put questions in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and if we will get to those after we've toured the main points. And secondly, that we will be joined soon by that third speaker I mentioned, Timo Lochocki, our visiting fellow, so he'll be on with us very shortly. Janka, what were your main thoughts?
Yeah, I do think as well, can you hear me? Sorry. I think my favorite comment of yesterday evening was the representative of the Mittelstand, who was saying, I do not understand the triumphant howling in the Konrad Adenauer house that is going on right now. How is this a clear mandate for policy change? I don't see how they're going to get there. And I do think this is something that to be taken very seriously for the German economy and for German industry. This is a really difficult and tricky situation because what they would want to see, kind of speedy action, investment, etc., all of that is not going to come incredibly easily right now. In the end, the CDU gained 4 percentage points in comparison to the last election. It's not that much. And to put it with Robert Habeck's words, it was in the end, a football reference is always a helpful one. It was like a penalty shot without a goalie. It was really easy to win this one, and actually they didn't. So this is something, and this puts them in the difficult situation. I would agree with you that the SPD performed at the sort of higher end of what was sort of what the dramatic expectations were. I think this is the reason why Klingbeil is also able to hold on to kind of keeping this together and form sort of the transition phase into a new version of the SPD leadership. But I do think this is sort of this is on the CDU that they don't have a 2/3 majority to do anything with on the financial side as well, because that would have been sort of their votes to bring in, and they clearly didn't do that. On the second comment would be on the Green side. I think it is less visible how dramatic this result is because the nominal change looks less dramatic. You lose 3 percentage points overall among the traffic light coalition. You lose the least out of the 3 partners. So it looks like, well, this is sort of like a relatively stable version of it. But if you look into the details of the numbers, there's a vast portion of direct mandates that were lost, particularly on both sides. So in conservative circles, in the German South, they lost against the CDU or the CSU, particularly in Bavaria as well. And in Berlin, dramatic losses vis-a-vis the Left Party. So that is, I think, the embodiment of what will happen, or what is now the strains that are on the party now. It's you're either not conservative enough or not left enough right now. And these pressures will obviously, in the opposition, have an easier ability to come out, because so far it has been, we're in government, everyone stand in line, everyone has to get in line behind the leadership. We were in the election campaign, everyone has to get in line and stand behind the party leadership. And in the opposition, this will obviously be it will be hard to keep it together, and it will be interesting to see in which direction the party will pull after this. More pragmatic, more left. My tendency would probably be slightly more towards the left, because this is what then my last takeaway is. There's an interesting role for the SPD to play, because the only 2 democratic opposition parties are now left parties. So if it intelligently plays the grand coalition, then it can actually get a lot done with those pressures as well, in terms of kind of getting SPD ideas into this not so grand coalition. So this, I think, in terms of the non-foreign policy side, my takeaways.
Thank you. Again, lots to unpack there too. And I see that Timo Lochocki, our visiting fellow, has joined us. Welcome, Timo. Great to have you with us. We're just talking about our initial takeaways from the election. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on the result. Particularly good to hear your take on the CDU and how its result is going down. Just to sort of to draw together a couple of threads from what Jana and Janka said. I mean, for me, I think it would be good to get onto the character of this new GroKo. And I think perhaps the defining traits relative to what we might have expected are, first of all, the tight numbers. So there's pretty small majority. So a lot of room for rebellions to derail votes in the Bundestag, and this blocking minority in the Bundestag getting in the way of constitutional change, debt brake reform, special funds, and so on and so forth. And then the other thing is this balance between the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. I think with the Union at the lower end of its expectations, and here it'd be great to hear your thoughts, Timo, and the SPD at the upper end, what looked like it might be a 2-to-1 relationship is looking more like maybe a 3-to-2. And so it'd be good to get on to kind of what we think maybe what the SPD will do with that relative strength as the junior partner. Will it go for more ministries? And what does it do to the internal politics in the SPD? I mean, as you mentioned, Jana, Lars Klingbeil, I saw already taken over the leadership of the Bundestag fraction of the SPD. So with him and Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, very much on the pragmatic wing of the party, including on foreign policy, it'd be interesting to see what a sort of comparatively reinforced leadership of that part of the SPD means. But let's get on that in a second. Timo, let's hear your thoughts. What do you make of the result?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. And I gotta admit, in particular, bear in mind that probably folks from other European countries currently tune in. This is a great day for Europe. This is almost the best case scenario that materialized yesterday evening. So I'm extremely relieved from a democratic point of view. So I'm sure you touched upon this before, but the mere fact that the liberals are out and the pro-Russian BSV is out will have a massive impact on the available pragmatism of the incoming government. They will not be constrained that much with the Schuldenbremse issue. I can get back to the Linke in a second. And the SPD will not be drawn to a pro-Putin position as it used to be beforehand. So the mere fact that these two parties didn't make it is maybe the greatest impact for Europe, which it's extremely small, but the impact is tremendous because now the German government has way more opportunities to unleash the German economic potential, and it's not forced to, in a sense, buy into pacifist rhetoric so much. When it comes to the blocking majority in the Bundestag, I had a few conversations about this yesterday evening and this morning already. There is a way to in a sense, to sideline this, that you can take all the issues which are against the left, which is especially, of course, reinforcing of the armed forces. You can try to arrange for by Sondervermögen, which doesn't require a two-thirds majority.
You need to change basic law for this, and you need to have the Linke as well. It's the same problem.
Yeah, but we don't need to have a constitutional change in both chambers, right?
I think you need 2/3 for the special fund, don't you? This is going to be vital in the next weeks, I think, because this will be. But let's just on that. I mean, do you think that Friedrich Merz is weakened by this result? I mean, you have a better window onto the inner workings of the CDU, CSU than most of us. I mean, does this undermine his ability to pull together that coalition and secure the compromises he needs from his party colleagues? He seemed relatively upbeat yesterday, I have to say, for someone who'd really underperformed his own experience. I mean, there was talk of 35% getting on for 40% as the aim of this campaign. Do you see that being a problem for him?
At this point in time, I do think the party is extremely relieved that there is a chance to form a coalition with only one single actor remaining. So the party will obviously unite behind the leader. The key question for the party forward is the migration question. And here I do think a coalition with the SPD is again great news for the country, because I do think it's most certainly not a reform coalition as Black-Green would have been or could have been, but striking a deal with the Greens on migration would have been way more complicated, while it's probably way more simple with the SPD. And if the CDU, CSU can get most of their demands met in the migration question, then the chances are high that they can agree for larger, in a sense, social democratic positions with social and finance. there is a tiny chance that what the SPD asks for is too much for the CDU, CSU to swallow, given, as you just outlined, Jeremy, how they're in a very interesting position. They are the kingmaker in spite of the mere fact they've lost so much. But I doubt that the CDU, CSU, if their migration demands are met, will be interested in calling new elections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Merz has spoken about the urgency of forming a government by Easter, as he said. Jana, do you want to just come in on the SPD in particular and what you see it asking for in these talks?
So I'm not a expert on the SPD, but what I think became clear already in the campaign is that they will insist on, I don't know, if like money for Ukraine, yes, but no social cuts to finance those. I think this is basically the hill they'll die on. It will be incredibly hard to reform. I mean, not to reform the Bürgergeld. I think the SPD itself has acknowledged that there are flaws, but overall, to significantly cut social spending, which is something that the CDU really wants, and the CSU, I think that will be kind of a tough struggle in the end. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's somewhat reminiscent of the traffic light coalition, because you've got a lot of priorities that are going to cost you a lot of money one way or another. The defense point, Ukraine, the social security point. Merz has pledged very sweeping tax cuts. You just wonder how that's all possible without some sort of debt brake reform, and a debt brake reform that you can pass with left party votes, as you probably, I imagine, would have to. Janka, do you want to just speak a bit about the state of the Greens? You know, this is the party that has put up the vice chancellor, the economy minister, the foreign minister for the last 3 years. I mean, they are resigned, I think, now to going into opposition. I think it's fair to say. What role do you see them playing as it were, you know, the other quote unquote mainstream party in this parliament outside of the Grand Coalition?
Yeah, I think it was striking to see the commentary last night. I think what Timo was referring to, sort of the relief in the CDU to not have to go with 3 parties, was mainly the relief of not having to go A, into the internal fight with the CSU over having the Greens in the coalition, and B, to not have to deal with the Greens. Because if you had kind of focused so much on the Greens in your anger over all your policy proposals, then it would have been hard to square that circle. So I thought the way Torsten Frey was commenting throughout the evenings, like initially very much like it's good and we don't want to work with the Greens, and then it was looking like the BSW could make it in, and then his comments were a bit more cautious, and then they were a bit more hawkish again. So you could literally see that playing out live on stage, how much of a problematic partner that would have been for vast parts of the CDU. So I think there was this, I think this is where I agree with Timo. I think this is much easier for them now to form this government. I think it will depend very much on whether the SPD will allow for sort of a reasonable collaboration with the opposition. Everyone's saying that there's a staatspolitische Verantwortung, that there's responsibility now to take, that it's also about sort of isolating the AfD. That will come down to how far left will the Greens turn after this election, and how constructive will the left party be. I think it will be quite defining right now to sort of put the pieces back together. This has been kept under wraps for a really long time, and for the Green Party, this is a self-identity moment as well, where they have to decide sort of, if we're not constrained by the constraints of being in government, where is our identity? Where does our identity really lie? And I think that will be tough weeks ahead. It's easier to do that in the opposition if you don't have to immediately form a government. How much is going to be left in terms of a constructive democratic force, like a strong opposition leader, a strong democratic opposition leader in the parliament? We will have to see. Absolutely.
No, that's really good. But I mean, finding that balance between sort of being a constructive part of the mainstream, but also playing that role of opposition, I think will be an interesting one for them. Well, let's pivot to foreign policy. I think we've laid the foundations for this with our discussion of the possible coalition and the various parties. I was very struck last night by Friedrich Merz's comment and I think others were too, in the Berliner Runde, in this discussion between the major party candidates, in which he said, for me, the absolute priority is to strengthen Europe as fast as possible to achieve our independence from the USA step by step. This is a remarkable line coming from a dyed-in-the-wool Atlanticist, someone who went into this campaign not that long ago talking about doing deals with Trump, saying if only we had a free trade deal with the US already, we wouldn't have to worry so much about the tariffs. Former leader of the Atlantic Brücke campaign group, which pushes for closer German-American relations, now saying that we want to accelerate forward to independence. Really remarkable language. And I mean, what does that mean about the priorities and the foreign policy disposition of a new grand coalition, assuming it does come together? Perhaps we hear from Jana and then Timo on that.
Let's start with Timo. He knows the CDU better than I do. Maybe he can explain why Merz has suddenly come around, like not only just a bit, but kind of 180 degrees, basically.
A Zeitenwende, for want of a better. Timo, what do you think?
I would in general be very cautious with what the CDU-CSU says before they have entered the government seats. Because you remember I said this in Warsaw 2 or 3 weeks ago, that the party is not really fully understanding yet the scope of the problems they're about to face in the coming 3 to 4 years. That's something you kind of see in particular when they talk about digital and when they talk about defense. So the proposals that are outlined for both are falling short on anything they will be exposed to in the next 2 or 3 months when they kind of enter the chancellery. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on what it currently says, but what you will do in 2 or 3 months. And the very key question is all hinges upon is which ministries does the party get? And do they kind of get the key ministries? Obviously, it's 2 ministries that are key. It's Interior and Finance. And though it's not defense and it's not state. And that's very important to bear in mind because the key shots will be taken in the other ministries. And I do think that what so far he has seen is that the US administration is meddling into German domestic politics, and they are strengthening the toughest enemy of the CDU, the far right, the AfD, which means now that he understands, oh my God, we would have come out way stronger if the AfD would have been much weaker. So how do we fight the AfD? How we fight the AfD in trying to push back this US influence? This, however, is not really based on a solid analytics of what the government's going to face in the next 2 or 3 months and weeks to go. And this will very much depend on, do they have the chance to really influence the social affairs in the country and the migration matter? And this, I'd say, needs to come first before the government has any energy to focus on foreign policy. So I need to emphasize this once more. There is tremendous push and the NATO summit and so forth, but any solid and thought through backed foreign policy proposals will probably come in autumn.
That surprises me, given Merz's language about the urgency of the moment and the reality that things are urgent and that the pressure on Europe is growing seemingly day by day. Jana, do you want to come in on that? And then yeah.
So I think there will also be tremendous pressure from Europe, and Merz has already, I think, signaled that he understands this. He has tried to build bridges with France, with Poland, with other European capitals. And so I slightly disagree with Timo, or maybe I hope I'm right, and I hope Timo is wrong and foreign policy gets a higher priority. Because I think, Jeremy, we have written this piece where we identified 3 strands of Merz's foreign policy thinking, and Atlanticism was one of those, the other being Europeanism and basically a Germany first approach, as we called it. And they are all 3 in tension with each other. But I think what we see now with actually lightning speed is how the Atlanticist pillar of Merz's thinking is changing. Before the election, you said it yourself, he talked about deals with Trump. I remember that there was a CDU delegation attending the Republican convention, coming back saying, oh, we can work with these guys. There is common ground. There is even like-mindedness. And now, I mean, already before the election, I think Merz was clear-eyed about the transatlantic relationship. He already said it needs to change drastically. He already said Biden was the last transatlantic president, kind of old school Cold War style. But now I think he is doubling down on Europe, or at least he needs to be aware that this is what he's signaling to the outside. When he says things like yesterday evening, I think he wanted to make sure that he kind of understands the magnitude of the challenge and what needs to be done. And I think this narrative, kind of, we need a strong Europe now. We need a strong Europe that is able to defend itself, that is able to be resilient, given the threats coming from Russia, China, but now also the United States. This is also something that he can use in his negotiations with the SPD. They have neglected the EU in recent years, but they still claim to be a very pro-European party. He can also use this vis-a-vis the opposition. I mean, not so much the AfD, of course, but the Greens and also Die Linke. So this strength, and I certainly hope that it can also help with finding the money if you do it the European way for defense. But actually, maybe my last point is I was surprised how harsh his words have been, given just reality and the fact that we are still utterly dependent on the United States when it comes to defense, and that even if we wanted, we cannot change this easily or quickly. So this is a matter of an orderly transition that will take, I don't know, ideally 5 years, 10 years. And we need the US on board for this. We need basically to find a deal with them, how to take more responsibility, clear timeline, but also we need them to support us still when it comes to fundamental questions. And maybe Merz is now of the opinion that they will basically leave Europe anyways, and we cannot negotiate with them any longer. I think this is a little premature, but this is just me.
Yeah, and German chancellors have form when it comes to setting expectations in Europe that they don't fulfill. I mean, remember during Trump 1, Merkel making that speech in Trudering in Munich saying the time when we can rely on others is over. When Macron visited her after his election in France, she quoted Hermann Hesse and said, "Jedem Anfang wohnt ein Zauber inne," in every little magic dwells in each beginning, and then didn't really do very much, or didn't take up his offer of a partnership on European reform. You could categorize Scholz's Zeitenwende speech as a partial kind of creation of expectations that weren't met as well, although that's perhaps a bit more debatable. Janka, would you like to come in there on that? And I'll also just append to that, if I may, a question about China. So obviously the Greens have been greatly diminished and the FDP have dropped out of the Bundestag altogether. And arguably those were the two probably most hawkish, for want of a better word, parties on China, and we're looking at a government of the two big Volkspartei and the two big people's parties that have been close to those commercial German interests that have driven that relationship. So thoughts on Merz and the Atlantic relationship and China, if you can do both at the same time.
Sure. I think I'll make a few kind of general points. So I think the delinking of foreign policy and domestic policy is entirely artificial. And that was done for the campaign process, and you can totally do that. And it's nice to talk about migration. You can pretend it's all about migration, but none of Germany's actual economic problems are solved with solving the problem of migration. So, and that I think realistically all parties agree on, because that's not what this is like politically actually then about in the end. What this is about sort of the economic policy will not be fixed within Germany. The economic policy will be fixed at a European level. The economic policy is not at the moment, the biggest challenge does not emanate from Russia. The biggest challenge comes from China undercutting Germany's kind of business model at the moment. So these are the realities, and I think that's where I would agree with Timo, that also the CDU-CSU has not fully addressed within its party, basically having a slightly schizophrenic approach to this, where Merz in a foreign policy speech talks about the axis of autocracy, and then at the same time basically says everything can stay the same on the trade front as long as we have free trade with China, it's all good. So that doesn't work when you're in government, and it won't work for the next weeks to come. I think the economic policy question, because it's always like, this is what the CDU is voted in for. This is the actual question. Can we fix the German economy? That is fundamentally a China question. And this fundamentally a China question that is now currently worsened by US policy. And that, I think that this bottom line is something that the CDU will have to face quite quickly. We saw actually Merz displaying some good instincts on that. Surprisingly, I think moving away from some of the, in the latter stages of the campaign, moving away from some of the earlier positions he has taken. So I think it will be the question about, can you get some sort of investment program industrial deal for the domestic side? Then the second question will be, do you understand that there will be no grand US-China bargain, and that there is the last thing that Germany needs to do is sort of appease China right now because it feels under pressure from the US side. I do think that there is an understanding that the China-Russia axis is real and that you have to fight back on that dimension as well. So I do think that these foreign policy questions are sort of mixed in. The future of the relationship with Russia, with China, and with the US are completely embedded and intertwined with the economic policy questions and are therefore front and center for every decision that is going to be taken in the next few weeks and for the coalition treaty. So I don't think it's about being hawkish or not on China in the end. You know, this is not an isolated topic anymore, but it is about what are the fundamental economic interests that Germany has. Who is fundamentally a problem for that? And what are the fundamental sort of challengers to the future economic policy that Germany wants to pursue? So I think that's where I would situate that at the moment. And that's certainly not solved by Chinese peacekeepers in Ukraine. That's something that was floated by many in the process, and I think this understanding that
I think you need to specify who you're talking about there.
No, I think even Jan van Aken raised it in the what we call the elephant round, that sort of we need to talk about sort of who we work with each other, and they raised the Linke raised the kind of Chinese peacekeepers, but this was raised by others, even in the conservative spectrum as well. The question of what role China will play. And there's a need to understand sort of that the role between China and Russia has fundamentally changed. And this means that these are two adversaries now and that they have to be seen as collective, and you would not want to have a forward presence of your kind of adversary's greatest ally staged next to your borders with technological capacities that outflank yours by a great degree. So I think there's not much of a case for that. And I think it's this sort of China policy realism that is actually just sort of an economic and foreign policy realism that is something that is good for the CDU and would be helpful for the CDU to embrace. And I think Matt has indicated that he'd be willing to do that. Let's see how far he gets.
Yeah, and I think your point about Germany's economic model and business model driving those foreign policy decisions and being intertwined with them is very well taken. And it, of course, brings us back to the debt brake and to also European fiscal and competitiveness reform, because of Germany that it depends more on domestic demand, European demand and investment, as opposed to that export-led model would need a different approach to those questions. So I absolutely agree that those are all tangled up together. And we're getting some great questions coming in the Q&A box, so keep those coming, and perhaps we can actually start answering some of them. We've addressed one or two points already. I had a question about Merz's comments last night about independence from the US. Let's sort of linger on that, on Merz and his European agenda. I'll wrap up a couple and throw them to the three of you. Jakob Kruppe asks, he asks us to comment on Merz's comments last night, which we've started doing. About his views changing in response to Trump. And he also asks, Merz spoke about his plans to engage with Paris and Warsaw early and more. What should we expect the Weimar Triangle format to emerge as an important, should we expect it to emerge as an important vehicle for their cooperation in Europe? Very good question. And of course, Merz has said that he intends to visit both Paris and Warsaw on his first day as Chancellor. James Rothwell asks, Merz has suggested joining the British-French nuclear umbrella. Do you think his coalition allies and the new AfD opposition would accept this? And is Germany, I think pretty straight answer, no, in terms of the AfD, but it'd be interesting to hear what we think about the SPD's openness to moves in that direction. And is Germany ready to change the status quo on nuclear weapons? And I'll throw in one more before turning it back to all of you. Question without a name, but it's a good one. Isn't Merz a traditional transatlanticist? How likely is it that a Union SPD coalition led by him will double down on Europeanizing German defense policies? So a little cluster of Merz and Europe questions there for you all. Who wants to come in first? Timo, would you like to address any of those?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I gotta repeat myself. So it's really about expectation management.
Yeah.
Europe and everybody in the foreign policy circle needs to bear in mind that regardless of what he says, the priority is migration and the debt brake. And these two things need to be taken care of first. And if there's no agreement struck on either of them, nothing is going to happen in foreign policy, because the government will then lack the unity and lacks the capacity to move forward. So what we also should kind of pay attention to is the migration bargain to be struck in the coming weeks, and if there is a way to kind of embrace the left for debt brake reform, or to figure out a way how to circumvent the left. This is kind of I think these two things, oddly enough, purely domestic, will decide Europe's future way more than any foreign policy decision. And what I like to chime in is like that he, of course, is keen on reaching out to Russia because he is like way more hawkish on Russia than others. This is one example of what I meant. It's not really thought through what this really entails. So, for instance, what it really means to double down on German defense, the money and the industrial policy is the easiest part of the jigsaw. The most important problem is the reintroduction of the draft. And this can kill any government in Germany. So basically, this is one of the issues which kind of so far nobody has kind of thought about, but this is going to be a major one for the CDU, CSU, and in particular for the SPD moving forward in a few years. And the second thing is that what I wrote a piece about for ECFR, the idea of joining the British or the French nuclear umbrella, this is the greatest loss of national sovereignty for Germany since 1949, if they would do that. So if they would do this, the conservative government would want a lot from London or from Paris. So this is most certainly not thought through yet. And the CDU-CSU will by no means accept this once they have seen it on the table. So, and I also like to point out too, it's a very open question if it would be in the interest of Europe to replace one nuclear hegemon with another nuclear hegemon. So I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation to be had. And the mere fact that Merz says, hey, I like the Macron guy, we had a super awesome conversation, this is history in the making, and Europe is important, yada, 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 yada. What else should he say? This is what you have to say. Any German chancellor needs to say that. But there is tremendous, in a sense, party political and domestic obstacles in the way to move forward in this direction.
So we come back again to this question of how much is this European reawakening rhetoric and nice words versus how much is it substance and genuine urgency. Jana, would you like to come in on any of those?
So maybe first on the nukes, because this is one of the most difficult topics for Germany. And I see a change here. So after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, some people came forward very cautiously, suggesting that we have a problem being so dependent on the United States and a president and the White House that cannot be counted on. Back then, the common wisdom was, we sit this out. This is the last thing we want to let go. So we understand the US wants to withdraw conventionally from Europe, but we want to make everything in our power, or we want to do everything in our power to keep the US engaged when it comes to the nuclear umbrella. What I find remarkable now is that already prior to the election, more people came forward saying we have a problem and we need to do something, including Friedrich Merz. And I think there is a greater readiness to start negotiations with the French. The question is on what, because models like, I don't know, extended nuclear sharing and all this is not really feasible with neither the French nor the Brits. So on what particularly, but I think Macron has suggested that one could start to talk about this issue. The Germans have been reluctant. I think they will be more open now going forward. Still, for me, that comes a little too fast, this kind of new narrative that now comes out of Merz. If I think back and recall all the conversations I also had in the MOD, like the German deep state is very much still convinced that we need the United States and that we cannot replace it easily overnight and that we need to have a negotiated transition or at least try to get one. And on nuclear, I think the idea would be, and that is what Hegseth, the American defense minister, said in Brussels, to keep the nuclear umbrella in place and to hand over basically conventional deterrence. That has many problems in itself. You cannot really detach the two, but still I don't see Germany being the first to now go for nukes. Also because we are kind of obliged by international law, by treaties that we have signed, like 2+4 treaty, preventing us from seeking nuclear weapons on our own. just maybe one additional point. I think the debt brake is not only a domestic topic, it's an entirely European and also foreign policy topic, because why should we reform the debt brake? I mean, why do we need these huge amounts of money? Of course, not only for defense, because we have much more investments to do, but defense and how to finance, especially kind of a smooth transition, and the Europeans now taking care of their own defense. This is why we need the money. If we don't come up with this money in either a national or European framework, and if Germany is not able to be a backbone for European conventional deterrence and defense, Europe has a big problem. So this is something that deeply affects, I think, how strong Europe will be in the future or not. Yeah, but maybe on foreign policy more broadly, on Ukraine and stuff, I've seen enthusiastic takes on Twitter, and here I'm entirely with Timo. Expectation management, I think, on Ukraine support. We will have the same questions with the SPD that we had. It's about money and it's about risk taking. And here one needs to be clear. I mean, Friedrich Merz has taken a much harsher and tougher stance towards Russia, very much appreciated by me personally, but not very much appreciated by some in his own party. So there are minister presidents in the former GDR that are not very sympathetic, and also kind of, yeah, if you look at people like Armin Laschet, they don't play a role now any longer, but the position they stand for is much more popular than one would think. So
just for those who aren't familiar with him, this is the CDU-CSU Chancellor candidate in 2021, unsuccessful, obviously, who's seen as I know you don't like this taxonomy, Janka, but more dovish than some others in the party on both Russia and China. That's very well taken, and I think that internal coalition within the CDU-CSU is going to be fascinating to watch, particularly as they've had a rather disappointing result. And
good that you mentioned the CSU, because I mean, in the last so-called Grand Coalition under Merkel, there was more infighting between the CSU and the CDU than between both and the SPD. So. And the CSU has its own opinion on Russia and China that doesn't necessarily align with that of Friedrich Merz.
Timo, do you want to come in there?
What I would like to summarize or point to is that basically the mere assumption that something Friedrich Merz says will define this government's position is extremely unlikely. So there is going to be a tremendous space for negotiations, need for negotiations, and then the negotiations will probably rely on two things: a rather great interval of how the various ministers can deal with this, and of course, it will be tremendously dependent on the momentum that will be defined by external forces entirely beyond our control. And this means, to my understanding, that the key ministries' leadership are utmostly decisive. So for instance, it's a tremendous difference if Pistorius takes finance or defense, or if he doesn't, or who takes over finance and the economy on the CDU's end. So I do think that the assumption of there being an overarching foreign policy plan is a bit too optimistic, but there is a high chance that a possible momentum being created might be taken up by 2 or 3 members of the cabinet which see through the geopolitical implications of this. And there is 2 or 3 people which would make a major difference. The question,
who do you have in mind?
I do think when it comes to geopolitics, it's most certainly Pistorius and Jens Spahn, who basically are amongst the 2 members in each party who clearly outline the geopolitical impact of any domestic decision, while the other actors are more focused on the domestic theater. Though I do think these questions, or kind of these personal, in a sense, placements, will be even as decisive as any coalition agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, my own assumption would be that the SPD goes for the foreign ministry and the defense ministry, and they keep Pistorius in place as defense minister. I don't know if anyone disagrees with that. And
no, the CSU, I mean, has publicly said that they want defense. So
but they don't have anyone obvious to fill the role, which I think
they think Dobrindt would be a fantastic candidate.
Let's not go down that.
So I would say
If anyone's been on
Sorry,
German trains
maybe we are
recently,
all
I
in
get
the
a
zone
sense
of having to lighten this up a little bit.
Okay, look, we've got a couple of questions on the Schuldenbremse, so I'll wrap those together. So Gerrit Ketio asks, on the Schuldenbremse, do you think SPD, CDU and Greens will change the constitution before the Bundestag convenes in 30 days? That would be quite something, wouldn't it? So there's that question, and we have another one from Thomas Lauritsen. Sorry if I'm mangling your name. How strong is the Linke opposition to debt brake reform in view of defence investment? Can they be convinced to get on board with the CDU, SPD, Greens on this, since they actually want debt brake reform? So just any further thoughts on the debt brake and that point about what sort of cooperation might be possible with the Linke? I don't know if Janka, would you like to come in on that?
Sure. I mean, I've said this kind of informally before, but I do think this is a big question. If you are if the CDU and the SPD form a coalition and then they declare an emergency, then they can circumvent at least some funding for defense. Then you get no spending on social issues. If you, on the other hand, strike some sort of a grand bargain and you can throw a package together in which you increase the defense spending, but also do investment, but also do something on social spending, then the left party can decide whether they want to be part of this bigger democratic consensus or part of the AfD and the fringes and blocking. I think the way Heidi Reicheneck positioned herself particularly seems to me more like she wants to be part of a democratic consensus in which she fights hard for the issues that she stands for. That to me would mean that there is potential for collaboration, but I guess it will remain to be seen how also the rhetoric of the coalition then emerges.
Yeah, although the fact you mentioned Heidi Reicheneck, I think points to the difficulties in that she, I think, deserves some credit for their strong result because she gave a storming speech in opposition to Merz in the Bundestag, in opposition to his passing a motion on migration with the AfD, and they've campaigned the left as a very pro-migration party. So you just wonder how much goodwill will be there. I mean, Jana, is there room for, as it were, a bit of budgetary hocus pocus here, where you relax the debt brake or you reform the debt brake to fund social spending and, as it were, clear up, like create fiscal room in the conventional budget to do more on defense? Is there something possible there, do you think?
I mean, Die Linke would always claim, could always be accused of having facilitated more defense spending one or the other way. So I think they would call the bluff maybe, but I don't know. I really very much hope that Janka is right and there is more pragmatism now in the party. When I hear Die Linke talking about foreign security and defense policy, they sound very much like they've always sounded to me, but maybe Janka is right and there is a new pragmatism given the fact that we are really in a dire situation and that I think the rest of Europe is also counting on us. But I think it will be really, really difficult.
Yeah. I was laying it out as a scenario, to be clear.
Yeah.
It's not like I would say that this is definitely what's going to happen. And I do believe that the word that should be defining our conversation is hocus pocus, because we'll need a lot of that in the next few years. I think you framed that quite right. So
I mean, for those watching who aren't sort of familiar with the left, it's been on quite a journey. I mean, this is the descendant party of the East German SED, so the governing party of East Germany that became then a democratic socialist party after the fall of the wall, and it has always been sort of bit on the fringes and was always quite a coalition itself. And when we talk about the CDU, CSU having their divides, it was a spectrum, and the sort of the more nativist part of that spectrum split off and became the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance, which has sort of left this what seemed like a kind of pretty weak rump of the party, more rooted in the big cities among a sort of left libertarian electorate almost, albeit with a few old veterans from its past who've actually sort of had a rebirth almost, these three silverhead types. And so you have a kind of strange mixture of sort of urban libertarian leftism with a sort of remnant kind of Eastern oriented foreign policy outlook. So it's quite an interesting beast, actually, and we'll have to think and engage with it more, I think, over the next weeks and months as it plays this role as it were, the kind of the missing link between the mainstream parties and a constitutional majority. Timo,
I'd like to point to a few optimistic scenarios tying onto what Janka said. So the chances for this debt brake reform are rather given, I think, for two reasons and under one condition. The one reason is that the pro-Putin wing is now gone in the left party, which is of tremendous importance here. That the BSW is out, and basically now you have pacifists but not pro-Putin actors. So in a sense, you can frame the increase of defense spending in like democratic resilience, fostering German social fabric whatsoever. So it's easier to sell it internally. The second thing is that, of course, the left party can be, in a sense, forced to decide whether they want to spend 100 billion more on education, but this comes at the price for 20 billion more in defense. I'm just using rough figures here. This is something which would increase tremendous pressure on the party. But this is the precondition adjustment. Either approach would require the CDU-CSU giving in tremendously when it comes to their social or fiscal policies, and their appetite to go left, quote unquote, on this will be decided on them getting through with their migration policy.
What do you mean by going left on this?
Well, basically what the left will demand is increased spending for social and educational purposes, which very much stands at odds with what the CDU-CSU campaigned on in the last 2 or 3 months. However, the CDU-CSU is aware of that they can strike a major bargain on social and fiscal matters if the most important issues for their rank and file, migration, is taken care of. That's why I'm always pointing to this, how these things are so extremely intermingled. So any space for maneuver for the CDU-CSU and foreign and the debt break depend on them winning on migration. If they've won here, whatever that is, for the party's perspective, then I do think there is a high chance that they are, in a sense, not grasping or literally not that parsimonious when it comes to the left party on the debt break.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, it's amazing how many question marks there are over the numbers. Again, there are all these different priorities. Already, the CDU-CSU election program had tens of billions of unfunded tax cuts. You already have this. What is it? It's a 30 billion hole in the defense budget just to keep it 2% once the special fund runs out. A lot of to come back to this, a lot of hocus pocus needed. Jana, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so just emphasizing that Die Linke, the left party, will be equally against tougher rules for migration. I mean, they campaigned for less money for weapons and more migrants, basically. That's maybe a bit polemic, but I have a question to Timo, because if you think things through and if you assume that you need a party like either the AfD or Die Linke voting with the government, how high do you think are the chances that if they make it a special fund for defense purposes, or like if they frame it around, we need a stronger Europe or a stronger Bundeswehr for defense in a stronger Europe to get more sovereign and to be less dependent on the United States. Do you think some would call for trying to get some AfD members to vote on this with them?
Well, if
I mean, that could also it's a possibility. Like, it doesn't need to be Die Linke; it can also be the AfD.
Very good point.
Right. So I don't think it will be the AfD. Period. Not in this coalition. It won't be the AfD. And if I'd be amongst those who frame this debate, I would not refer to the US, neither to Europe. I would refer to, this is about strengthening the German state and strengthening the German industrial core and strengthening the social fabric in this society. That this will automatically have tremendous positive implications for wider Europe, granted, but I wouldn't sell it as a European or European sovereign project. And in particular, bearing in mind that the CDU-CSU's appetite for embracing larger European supranational integration is extremely low, and that your prime target audience hereby is Die Linke, which is primarily interested in social and material concerns. I would frame it rather as an industrial policy which requires a stronger German state. And here I think what Janka said, the most likely outcome I do think is that you have any like emergency calling which will allow you to kind of circumvent the debt break needed for defense spending, and then try to have the fiscal maneuvers, the fiscal space for this created by a debt break reform with the left party.
While we're on the FD, sorry, Timo, did you want to add
If I
something?
may add one thing, because this is so important here. The key actors for this maneuver are the Fraktionsvorsitzende and the Minister of Finance.
Fraktionsvorsitzende are the leaders of the parliamentary groups, just for those.
So basically, all these overarching concerns and frames and theories, they boil down to, can 4 or 5 probably dudes get their act together? And here, the very, I'd say, geopolitical outlook of these 4 or 5 figures is going to be tremendously important. So the best case scenario is, for instance, you have these negotiations, and 2 out of these 4 are Jens Spahn and Boris Pistorius. And the worst case is none of them is part of this bargain. Then everything gets way more complicated. So I know this is dire news for Europe, but the personal factor is extremely important here, I think.
A couple more questions related to that, actually. Timothy Dowes asks, the FD did well, but didn't increase their support through the election campaign. Does this tell us something about the influence of foreign intervention, brackets Musk and Vance, and the role of social media? And actually, there's a question for you, Timo, so perhaps you can address the two of them together. David Kipp asks, and maybe I missed this at the beginning, but what elements do you think need to be brought together to solve the migration question? I was pondering that myself. What do you think that bargain looks like that opens up the path to those other compromises?
Yeah, I think the first one about foreign intervention and like amplification of fragmentation via social media, I do think we have been tremendously lucky here. The BSV got 4.9.7. So basically what we see is that the parties that count on fragmentation in Germany in the broader scope, which is the BSV and the AfD on the cultural axis, and clearly the FDP on the economic axis, they together got 30%. And we are just lucky that only 20% show in the parliament. So I do think that amplifying fragmentation with social media works tremendously well. For a change, a liberal democracy in the West was lucky that it didn't play out so well that 2 fringe parties that play on this didn't get into the parliament. But it wouldn't have taken much for us talking about Dutch or Austrian circumstances if the BSV or the FDP would have just gotten a little bit more. So here, very important, that's why my mood is so extremely uplifted. Germany and Europe was extremely lucky yesterday evening. I wouldn't refer to this with structural forces too much. And sorry, the second one is, sorry?
Just very briefly, because we're approaching our end of our time, but what is that? What is the migration policy here?
Yeah, right. Okay, you're right. But the migration policy thing is not so much about concrete policies, but symbolic arrangements where the CDU-CSU can showcase, here is the strong state being reintroduced. So for instance, we spoke about this beforehand, it's not so much about whether the numbers really go down. The CDU-CSU has picked a number, so placed in their favor, but the CDU-CSU can pick out different numbers that play out in their favor once they are in government. What you need is pictures. Heavily guarded German border controls. This is what you need. And you need people being deported against their will. And a lot of use of German armed forces in the right light of the media.
Interesting. So we're running up at the end of our session, but I'm going to do a very quick fire final question, which is for all of you. Do you think Germany will have a government by Easter? So since you have the floor, Timo, you go first. Yes or no?
I have no clue.
Okay. Jana, will you hazard a prediction?
I'm doubtful, but I'm always more on the pessimistic side. I'm German, after all.
Janka, what about you?
I think we'll have a government and then it takes luck and magic.
Indeed, and that famous hocus pocus. I tend to think we will have a government by Easter, for what it's worth.
But that would mean that we possibly have a budget before summer break, which would be fantastic, because that is, just to mention it here, it's not only the coalition treaty, they need to negotiate first thing on a budget.
Yeah, and like I said, there are these massive question marks over those numbers. I mean, if they can pull that off, that will be quite an achievement. Well, fascinating stuff. I'm sorry we didn't get through every single question. For what it's worth, Jana and I will be doing another episode of our Searching for Deutschland podcast, which has been running throughout the election campaign, looking at those foreign policy issues. So if you haven't already, check out our past episodes. We take a sort of long-term view on a number of these. Excellent episode with Janka on China, for example, all still very much relevant. And we have another episode out on, I think, Thursday, or was it Friday this week, where we will I will try and see if we can work in some answers to some of the other questions we didn't get to here. But for now, thank you very much indeed, Jana, Janka, and Timo, and thank you everyone for tuning in and joining us. Have a good Monday.